The small conservation room in the basement of the Salem Historical Society smelled of chemical solvents and aged paper. Elizabeth Mercer had spent most of her career restoring historical documents and photographs, but the large classroom portrait from 1871 had proven to be a particularly challenging project. The image had been discovered during renovations of the old Salem Academy building, sealed behind a false wall in what had once been the headmaster's office. "How's it coming along?" Thomas Wells, the society's curator, leaned against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand. Elizabeth carefully dabbed a specialized solution onto a discolored corner of the photograph. "Almost finished, actually. The chemical degradation was worse than I initially thought, but I've managed to bring back most of the detail." The portrait showed 34 young girls arranged in 3 neat rows, wearing identical dark dresses with white collars, their hair styled similarly in the fashion of the time. Their teacher, a severe-looking woman with her hair pulled back tightly, stood to the side. It was a typical class portrait from the period, albeit unusually well preserved, despite the damage from years of neglect. "The Academy Board is going to be thrilled," Thomas said. "They're planning a whole exhibit around the school's history for the sesquicentennial." Elizabeth nodded absently, her attention drawn to something in the photograph. She leaned closer, squinting through her magnifying glass. "Tom, can you bring that lamp over here?" He set down his coffee and positioned the articulated lamp where she indicated. Elizabeth adjusted the magnifying glass, focusing on the back row of students. "That's odd. What is it?" "This girl here." She pointed to a pale-faced student standing at the end of the back row. The girl had a peculiar, vacant expression, her eyes seeming to look directly at the camera, while the other students gazed slightly away. "And now look at this." Her finger moved to the shadowy area behind the teacher, where the same face appeared to be peering out from the darkness. Thomas frowned, leaning in for a better look. "It's probably just someone who looks similar. These old photos can be deceptive. No, look closely at the hair, the facial structure, even the small birthmark near her eye. It's identical." Elizabeth's voice had taken on an edge of unease. "This is the same girl, appearing twice in one photograph. That's impossible. Even with today's technology, that would be difficult to achieve. In 1871, Thomas shook his head. "There must be another explanation." "I know what I'm seeing, Tom." Elizabeth sat back, rubbing her eyes. "I've been restoring historical photographs for 20 years. This isn't a mistake or a trick of the light." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Maybe twins, dressed identically and posed to look like the same person. Why would anyone do that?" She gestured toward the image. "And look at the way she's partially hidden in the shadows. It's almost as if she wasn't meant to be seen." Later that evening, after Thomas had gone home, Elizabeth remained in the conservation room, unable to tear herself away from the photograph. She digitally scanned the image and was examining it on her computer, zooming in on both appearances of the mysterious girl. There was something unsettling about the girl's expression. While the other students appeared solemn or slightly nervous, as was common in photography of that era when subjects had to remain still for extended periods, this girl's face held something different, a knowing look, almost mocking. Elizabeth began searching through the Society's digital archives for information about Salem Academy in 1871. The school had been prestigious in its time, educating the daughters of Salem's elite families until it closed in 1923. She found the class roster for 1871 and began matching names to faces as best she could, using family records and descriptions. At midnight, the old building creaking around her, Elizabeth finally found what she was looking for. A newspaper article from November 1871 reported the disappearance of a student named Margaret Holloway, age 12. The girl had vanished from her dormitory room one night, leaving behind all her belongings. The article mentioned that a search had been conducted, but no trace of the girl was ever found. The article included a small portrait of Margaret Holloway. It was the same girl. Elizabeth printed the photograph and the article, sliding them into her bag. As she did, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the class portrait, the second appearance of Margaret, the one partially hidden in the shadows, seemed to be pointing at something. Elizabeth zoomed in further, enhancing the image. The girl's finger was directed at another student in the front row, a pretty blonde girl with a ribbon in her hair. Making a quick note of this detail, Elizabeth shut down her computer and prepared to leave. As she reached for the light switch, a sudden cold draft swept through the room, rustling the papers on her desk. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper, a child's voice, saying, "Find her." Elizabeth froze, her heart racing. Then she flipped the switch, plunging the room into darkness, and hurried up the stairs. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived early, determined to identify the blonde girl in the photograph. She had slept poorly, dreams filled with shadowy corridors and the sound of children's laughter. Thomas found her surrounded by old yearbooks and student records. "You look terrible," he said, placing a cup of coffee beside her. "Did you sleep at all?" Elizabeth pushed a strand of hair from her face. "I found something. The girl in the photograph, the one who appears twice, her name was Margaret Holloway. She disappeared from the school in November 1871, just weeks after this picture was taken." Thomas's expression grew serious. "That's strange timing." "There's more." Elizabeth pointed to the blonde girl in the front row. "I believe this is Catherine Prescott. Her family was one of the wealthiest in Salem at the time. According to the records, she died a month after Margaret disappeared, drowned in the pond on the school grounds." "Jesus," Thomas muttered. "What are you suggesting?" Elizabeth hesitated. "I don't know yet. I don't." But in the photograph, the second appearance of Margaret, the one in the shadows, is pointing at Catherine, almost like she's marking her. "This is getting morbid, Liz." Thomas took a step back from the table. "Maybe we should just focus on finishing the restoration and leave the historical detective work to someone else." "I can't just ignore this, Tom." Elizabeth's voice was firm. "Two girls from the same class died or disappeared within weeks of each other, and now we have this strange photographic anomaly connecting them. Don't you think that warrants investigation?" Thomas sighed. "Fine, but let's be methodical about this. What do we know about the photographer?" Elizabeth consulted her notes. "A man named Silas Barrett. He was quite renowned in the area, known for his technical innovations in photography." "Let's start there, then," Thomas suggested. "See if there's any mention of unusual techniques that might explain the double image." They spent the morning researching Barrett's work and techniques, but found nothing that could explain Margaret's dual appearance in the photograph. By noon, Elizabeth was feeling increasingly frustrated. "I'm going to visit the old academy grounds," she announced, gathering her things. "Maybe being in the physical space will provide some insight." "Want company?" Thomas offered. Elizabeth shook her head. "I think I need to do this alone." Salem Academy had been converted into luxury apartments years ago, but the original facade remained largely unchanged. Elizabeth stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the imposing red brick building with its ornate cornices and tall windows. To the east, where the dormitories had once stood, was now a well-maintained garden with a small pond, presumably the same pond where Catherine Prescott had drowned. Elizabeth approached the building's management office and introduced herself as a historian researching the property's past. The manager, a friendly woman named Susan, was happy to show her around. "Most of the interior was completely redesigned," Susan explained as they walked through what had once been the main hall, "but we kept some original features. The grand staircase, some of the woodwork, and the headmaster's office. That's now our community room." Elizabeth's interest piqued at the mention of the headmaster's office. "That's actually where the photograph I'm researching was found, behind a false wall." Susan looked intrigued. "Really? I didn't know that. The renovations were before my time. I can show you the room, though." The community room retained the grandeur of its original purpose, with high ceilings and large windows overlooking the garden. Elizabeth could easily imagine it as the headmaster's domain, a place where students were brought for discipline or commendation. "Do you know if any of the original structure remains behind these walls?" Elizabeth asked, running her hand along the painted drywall. Susan shrugged. "I couldn't say for certain. The contractors might have kept some of the original framing." "Is it important?" "Just curious," Elizabeth replied, though her mind was racing with possibilities. Why had someone hidden the photograph behind a wall? And when? After thanking Susan for the tour, Elizabeth made her way to the garden. The November air was crisp, and dead leaves crunched beneath her feet as she approached the pond. It was smaller than she had expected, surrounded by ornamental grasses and a stone pathway. A simple plaque mentioned that this had been part of the original academy grounds, though it made no reference to Catherine's drowning. Elizabeth sat on a bench, contemplating the still water. According to the newspaper accounts she'd found, Catherine's body had been discovered early in the morning by a groundskeeper. The death had been ruled accidental. The girl had apparently gone out at night, perhaps for a clandestine meeting, and fallen in. But in light of Margaret's disappearance just weeks earlier, Elizabeth wondered if there might be more to the story. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elizabeth decided to make one more stop before heading home. The Salem cemetery was just a few blocks away, and she knew from her research that both the Prescott and Holloway families had plots there. The cemetery was quiet, most visitors having departed as dusk approached. Elizabeth found the Prescott family plot easily. A large, ornate monument marked the site. Catherine's grave was there, a smaller stone with a carved angel atop it. The inscription read, "Catherine Ann Prescott, 1859-1871, beloved daughter, taken too soon." Finding the Holloway plot proved more difficult. After nearly giving up, Elizabeth finally located it in an older section of the cemetery. Unlike the Prescott's grand monument, the Holloway marker was simple and weathered, and curiously, there was no stone for Margaret. Instead, a small plaque had been added to the family marker, "In memory of Margaret Holloway, 1859-1871, lost but not forgotten." Elizabeth stood between the two graves, separated by both distance and circumstance, yet connected by the strange photograph and their untimely deaths in the same year. As she was about to leave, she noticed something odd about Catherine's gravestone. Near the base, partially obscured by grass, was a small carved symbol, what appeared to be an eye inside a triangle. Elizabeth knelt down, brushing away the grass to get a better look. The symbol was definitely intentional, not a natural flaw in the stone. She took out her phone and searched for the symbol, finding that it was often associated with protective magic or watching over the dead. But who had felt Catherine needed such protection, and from what? As she rose to her feet, Elizabeth felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the November air. For a brief moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing among the distant gravestones, the silhouette of a young girl in a dark dress with a white collar. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Elizabeth spent the next week immersed in research, her restoration work on the photograph temporarily forgotten. She had taken a personal leave from the Historical Society, citing family matters, though Thomas knew the real reason. He had expressed concern about her growing obsession, but hadn't tried to stop her. Her apartment had become a makeshift investigation center. Timeline charts covered one wall, connecting the lives of Margaret Holloway and Catherine Prescott. Printouts of historical documents, newspaper clippings, and family histories were stacked on every surface. And at the center of it all, a large print of the class portrait, with both appearances of Margaret circled in red marker. Elizabeth had managed to track down the descendants of several students in the photograph, hoping they might have family stories or documents that could shed light on the mystery. Most had nothing useful to share, but one elderly woman, the great-granddaughter of a student named Eleanor Putnam, had mentioned a diary. My grandmother always said that Eleanor kept a diary during her time at the academy, the woman had told Elizabeth over the phone. I think it might still be in the attic somewhere. If you're really interested, I could try to find it. 3 days later, a package arrived containing a small, leather-bound book with yellowed pages covered in faded handwriting. Elizabeth had spent hours carefully turning the fragile pages, reading Eleanor's accounts of daily life at Salem Academy in 1871. Most entries were mundane: complaints about strict teachers, excitement over upcoming holidays, gossip about fellow students. But as Elizabeth approached the entries from October and November 1871, the tone changed. October 15th, 1871. Catherine received another letter today. She wouldn't tell anyone who it was from, but she was smiling all through dinner. Margaret watched her the whole time with that strange look she gets. I don't know why Catherine is friends with her. Margaret is odd, always whispering to herself and staring at people. Miss Hartford caught her in the East Wing after hours last week, but Margaret claimed she was sleepwalking. No one believed her. October 28th, 1871. We had our class portrait taken today. Mr. Barrett brought his new camera. We had to stand very still for what felt like hours. Margaret was late, as usual, and Miss Winters was furious. She made Margaret stand in the back row as punishment. The strangest thing happened during the photograph. Margaret was standing beside me, but then I saw her slip away and move behind Miss Winters. I thought the photograph would be ruined, but Mr. Barrett didn't seem to notice. November 5th, 1871. Margaret is gone. Her bed was empty this morning and all her things are still here. The teachers are saying she ran away, but no one runs away without taking anything. Some girls are saying she went to meet someone in the woods and got lost. Catherine has been very quiet since Margaret disappeared. I caught her crying in the washroom yesterday, but she wouldn't tell me what was wrong. November 30th, 1871. Catherine is dead. They found her in the pond this morning. They're saying she drowned, that she must have fallen in accidentally, but I don't believe it. Catherine was afraid of the water. She would never go near the pond willingly, especially not at night. Some of the girls are saying they heard her arguing with someone the night she died. Miss Winters has forbidden us from discussing it. They're sending us home early for Christmas. I don't think I want to come back. Elizabeth read and reread these entries, feeling a growing sense of dread. Eleanor's account confirmed that Margaret had indeed moved during the photograph, explaining her dual appearance. But it raised more questions than it answered. What was the relationship between Margaret and Catherine? Was there a connection between Margaret's disappearance and Catherine's death? Her research had also uncovered some disturbing details about the Holloway family. Margaret's father, Dr. James Holloway, had been a respected physician in Salem, known for his interest in experimental treatments and psychological research. After Margaret's disappearance, he had become increasingly reclusive, eventually taking his own life in 1873. Margaret's mother had been institutionalized shortly after, diagnosed with hysteria and delusional behavior. Most intriguing was an article Elizabeth had found in the archives of a medical journal from 1870, authored by Dr. Holloway. Titled On the Duality of Consciousness and the Possibility of Psychic Projection, the paper theorized about the existence of a secondary consciousness that could, under certain conditions, manifest independently of the physical body. The article had been largely dismissed by the medical community as pseudoscience, but it had gained a following among those interested in spiritualism and the occult, both popular topics in late 19th century New England. Elizabeth was deep in thought, connecting these new pieces of information when her phone rang. It was Thomas. "Liz, you need to come to the society right away." "What's wrong?" "Someone broke into the conservation room last night. The photograph is gone." Elizabeth's heart sank. "I'm on my way." The conservation room was in disarray when Elizabeth arrived. Drawers had been pulled open, contents scattered across the floor. The glass case where the original photograph had been stored was empty, the lock broken. The security system was disabled, Thomas explained, surveying the damage. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Was anything else taken? Elizabeth asked, already knowing the answer. No, just the photograph. The police have been here, but without security footage, there's not much to go on. Elizabeth felt a creeping sense of unease. This can't be a coincidence, Tom. Someone doesn't want us investigating this. Or someone else is interested in the same mystery, Thomas suggested. Either way, it's out of our hands now. The police will handle it. Elizabeth wasn't convinced. I've made too much progress to stop now. I have copies of the photograph and all my research notes at home. Thomas looked at her with concern. Liz, be careful. This is starting to feel dangerous. I'll be fine, she assured him, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Back at her apartment, Elizabeth double-checked her locks and settled in for another night of research. She had been working on identifying the other students in the photograph, hoping to find someone else who might have witnessed something important. Around midnight, she came across a name that stopped her cold, Rebecca Barrett. According to the class roster, Rebecca had been a student at Salem Academy in 1871. Barrett was not an uncommon name, but Elizabeth couldn't help wondering if there was a connection to Silas Barrett, the photographer. A quick search confirmed her suspicion. Rebecca was Silas Barrett's daughter, and she had been in the same class as Margaret and Catherine. In the photograph, she was seated in the front row, 2 students away from Catherine. Elizabeth quickly looked up what had become of Rebecca. Unlike Margaret and Catherine, Rebecca had lived a long life, graduating from the academy in 1877 and later marrying a businessman named Frederick Whiting. She had died in 1932 at the age of 73. More importantly, Elizabeth discovered that Rebecca had a great-granddaughter still living in Salem, an 84-year-old woman named Virginia Whiting, residing in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. The next morning, Elizabeth called the nursing home and arranged to visit Virginia that afternoon. She spent the intervening hours compiling questions and gathering the materials she wanted to bring, including a copy of the class photograph. Maple Ridge Senior Living was a modern facility set among tall trees with large windows and a welcoming atmosphere. Virginia Whiting's room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a garden that was now barren in the late autumn chill. Virginia herself was a small, frail woman with bright, intelligent eyes that lit up when Elizabeth explained the purpose of her visit. My great-grandmother's school days? Now that's not something people often ask about, Virginia said, gesturing for Elizabeth to take a seat. What's your interest in old Rebecca? Elizabeth carefully explained about the photograph and its restoration, showing Virginia the copy she had brought. She pointed out Rebecca in the front row, but didn't immediately mention Margaret's unusual dual appearance. Virginia put on her glasses and studied the image. Yes, that's her. I have a copy of this somewhere, though not as clear as yours. She used to tell stories about her time at the academy, said it was the most beautiful and terrible place she'd ever known. Terrible? Elizabeth asked. What did she mean by that? Virginia's face grew serious. The academy had a dark side, according to Rebecca, strict to the point of cruelty. And there were incidents, accidents, disappearances that were hushed up to protect the school's reputation. Like Margaret Holloway's disappearance? Elizabeth ventured. Virginia's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, that was one. Rebecca spoke of her often. They weren't close friends. Rebecca found Margaret unsettling, but they had grown up together in Salem. Rebecca believed that Margaret hadn't run away, as the official story claimed. What did she think happened? Virginia hesitated. This is where Rebecca's stories became difficult to believe. She claimed that Margaret had abilities, unnatural abilities. She could be in 2 places at once, or so Rebecca believed. Elizabeth's heart raced. Like in this photograph? She pointed to Margaret in the back row, then to her second appearance in the shadows. Virginia leaned closer, her breath catching. Yes, exactly like that. Rebecca mentioned this photograph. She said it was proof of what Margaret could do. The elderly woman looked up at Elizabeth with wide eyes. "How did you know to look for that?" "I noticed it during the restoration," Elizabeth explained. "But I didn't know what it meant." "Did Rebecca ever say more about Margaret's abilities?" Virginia nodded slowly. According to Rebecca, Margaret's father had been experimenting with her since she was young. Dr. Holloway was obsessed with the idea of separating consciousness from the physical body. He believed Margaret had a natural talent for it, and he enhanced it through his treatments. What kind of treatments? Rebecca didn't know the details, but she said Margaret would sometimes appear to be in a trance-like state, and that she could make herself seen in places where she wasn't physically present. Virginia's voice dropped to a near whisper. Rebecca claimed to have seen it herself once, Margaret sitting in class while simultaneously standing outside the window, watching them. Elizabeth thought about Eleanor's diary entry, describing how Margaret had moved during the photograph. And what about Catherine Prescott? Did Rebecca ever mention her? Virginia's expression darkened. Catherine was Rebecca's best friend. Her death devastated Rebecca. She never believed it was an accident. Did she think Margaret was involved? Yes and no. Rebecca believed that Margaret had developed feelings for Catherine, romantic feelings that weren't reciprocated. She said Margaret would follow Catherine, appearing to her when they were alone. Virginia paused. But after Margaret disappeared, Catherine began acting strangely, nervous, distracted. She told Rebecca that she was seeing Margaret everywhere, in her room at night, in mirrors, standing at the foot of her bed. So Rebecca thought Catherine's death was, what? Suicide? Murder? Virginia shook her head. Neither exactly. Rebecca believed that Margaret had never truly disappeared, that somehow she had learned to exist without her physical body, using her projected self to interact with the world. She believed that Margaret had lured Catherine to the pond that night, though for what purpose she wasn't sure. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The theory was outlandish, yet it aligned eerily with Dr. Holloway's research and the evidence of the photograph. "There's one more thing," Virginia said, reaching for a drawer in her bedside table. "Rebecca kept this her whole life. She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me. I've never shown it to anyone else." She withdrew a small worn envelope and carefully removed its contents, a folded piece of paper and what appeared to be a lock of blonde hair tied with a faded ribbon. "This was found in Catherine's hand when they pulled her from the pond. Rebecca took it before anyone else could see it." Elizabeth unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. On it was a childish drawing in faded ink, a pond with two figures standing beside it. One figure was clearly meant to be Catherine, with her blonde hair. The other was partially transparent, drawn with lighter lines, like a ghost. At the bottom of the page, in careful script, were the words, "I will never leave you." The drive back from Maple Ridge took Elizabeth through the older part of Salem, past historical buildings and ancient trees now bare in the November cold. Her mind was reeling from Virginia's revelations, trying to make sense of a story that defied rational explanation. Dr. Holloway's experiments with his daughter, Margaret's apparent ability to project herself, Catherine's death. It all seemed like something from a Gothic novel rather than historical fact. And yet the photograph provided tangible evidence that something extraordinary had occurred. Lost in thought, Elizabeth almost missed the figure standing at the side of the road, a young girl in a dark dress, her pale face expressionless as she watched the car pass. Elizabeth slammed on the brakes, pulling over abruptly. By the time she looked back, the figure was gone. Heart pounding, Elizabeth sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. Had she really seen what she thought she'd seen? Or was her mind playing tricks on her, influenced by the disturbing story she'd just heard? After a few minutes, she continued driving, more slowly now, scanning the roadside. There was no sign of the girl, and Elizabeth tried to convince herself it had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Back at her apartment, Elizabeth found the door unlocked. She was certain she had locked it that morning. She always did. Cautiously, she pushed the door open, half expecting to find her place ransacked like the conservation room. Instead, everything was exactly as she had left it, with one exception. On her desk, where there should have been nothing but her laptop and notes, sat the original class photograph from 1871, the one that had been stolen from the Historical Society. Elizabeth approached it slowly, as if it might somehow be dangerous. The photograph appeared undamaged, resting atop her research papers. She touched it gingerly, confirming it was real. How had it gotten here? Who had returned it, and why? She called Thomas immediately. "The photograph is here in my apartment," she said without preamble when he answered. "What? How?" "I don't know. Someone broke in and left it on my desk." Thomas was silent for a moment. "Liz, this is getting too strange. I think you should call the police." "And tell them what?" "That I'm investigating a 150-year-old mystery involving a girl who could supposedly be in two places at once, that someone stole a photograph and then returned it to me." Elizabeth shook her head, though Thomas couldn't see it. "They'd think I was crazy." "Then stay with me tonight," Thomas offered, "or I can come over. You shouldn't be alone after someone broke into your place." "I'll be fine," Elizabeth assured him, though she wasn't convinced. "I'll call you if anything else happens." After hanging up, Elizabeth examined the photograph more closely. Something about it seemed different, though she couldn't immediately identify what. She compared it to her digital copy, analyzing every detail. Then she saw it. In the original photograph, the second appearance of Margaret, the one in the shadows, was no longer pointing at Catherine. Now her arm hung at her side, like the other students. And her expression had changed. The knowing look replaced by something that looked almost like sorrow. Elizabeth stepped back from the desk, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. Photographs didn't change on their own. It was impossible. She must be mistaken, confused by the differences between the original and her digital copy. She decided to scan the photograph again, to have a new digital version for comparison. As she was setting up her scanner, the lights in her apartment flickered, then went out completely. Elizabeth froze, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the sudden darkness. The only illumination came from the streetlights outside, casting long shadows across her living room. She fumbled for her phone, turning on its flashlight. As the beam cut through the darkness, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of something, or someone, reflected in the window. A pale face, framed by dark hair, watching her from what should have been empty space. Elizabeth spun around, directing the light toward where the figure should have been standing. There was nothing there, just her furniture and the wall covered in her research notes. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding small in the darkness. "Is someone there?" No response came, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air in the apartment felt different, heavier, colder. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her face. Moving carefully through the darkened space, Elizabeth made her way to the circuit breaker in the hallway. None of the switches had been tripped. Whatever had caused the power outage wasn't in her apartment. As she turned to go back to the living room, Elizabeth saw her. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, standing at the end of the hallway. She wore a dark dress with a white collar, her hair styled in the fashion of the late 19th century. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on Elizabeth. It was Margaret Holloway, exactly as she appeared in the photograph. Elizabeth's phone slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, plunging the hallway into darkness once more. When she retrieved it and raised the light again, the girl was gone. "This isn't real," Elizabeth whispered to herself. "It can't be real." Yet every instinct told her that what she had seen was no hallucination. The chill in the air, the heaviness of the atmosphere. It was as if something had crossed over from another time, another state of existence. Elizabeth retreated to her living room, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to think logically. If, and it was a big if, What Virginia had told her was true. If Margaret Holloway had somehow learned to project her consciousness beyond her physical body, could that projection have persisted after death? Could it still be active all these years later? Dr. Holloway's research had theorized about the separation of consciousness from the physical form. What if he had succeeded in ways even he hadn't anticipated? What if Margaret's consciousness had become untethered, able to manifest across time? The photograph had been hidden behind a wall in the headmaster's office for over a century. Had someone sealed it away for a reason? To contain whatever presence was attached to it? Elizabeth's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from her desk, the soft rustle of paper. In the dim light, she could see the photograph moving, sliding across the surface as if pushed by an invisible hand. Gathering her courage, Elizabeth approached the desk. The photograph had stopped moving, but something about it had changed again. She directed her phone's light at it, examining the image. Margaret's second appearance, the one in the shadows, was gone. The space where she had been was now empty, showing only the wall behind her. A soft voice spoke directly behind Elizabeth. She didn't understand. She wasn't supposed to die. Elizabeth whirled around, finding herself face to face with the spectral form of Margaret Holloway. The girl stood just a few feet away, more solid-looking than before, though still with an ethereal quality, as if she weren't fully present in the physical world. "Margaret?" Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying Elizabeth with those dark, knowing eyes. "You've been looking for me, asking questions, disturbing things that should stay buried." "I wanted to understand what happened," Elizabeth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "To you and to Catherine." Margaret's expression hardened. "Catherine was my friend, my only friend. She promised we would always be together." "But something went wrong," Elizabeth guessed. "The night she died." Margaret seemed to flicker like a candle flame in a draught. "Father's experiments changed me. I could go places without my body, be seen where I wasn't physically present. At first, it was just for short periods, but I got stronger. I could stay away longer, go farther." "The photograph," Elizabeth said. "You moved during it." Margaret nodded. "I wanted to see if I could appear twice. It worked." A faint smile played at her lips. "Father would have been proud." But you disappeared after that. What happened?" The smile faded. "One night I stayed out too long. When I tried to return to my body, I couldn't find my way back. I was lost, drifting. I could see everyone, talk to some of them, but not return to myself. And Catherine?" Margaret's form seemed to darken, the air around her growing colder. "She was frightened when I appeared to her. She didn't understand that it was still me. I just wanted her help to find my way back. I thought if I showed her the pond, where the veil between worlds is thinnest, she could help me return. But she drowned," Elizabeth said softly. "It was an accident." Margaret's voice rose, the lights in the apartment flickering in response. "She fell. I tried to save her, but I couldn't. I had no physical form to pull her out." Elizabeth took a step back, unnerved by the spirit's sudden intensity. "And afterward? What happened to you?" Margaret's form stabilized, the emotional surge passing. "I was trapped. Without my body, without Catherine. I stayed near the academy for years, watching the other students come and go. When they sealed the photograph behind the wall, I was bound to it somehow. It kept me here, anchored to this place. And now that it's been found, now I can finally leave," Margaret said, her voice taking on a hopeful tone. "But not alone." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. "What do you mean?" "You freed me from the photograph," Margaret explained, as if it were obvious. "You understand me, what happened to me. You can help me find my way back." "Back to what?" Elizabeth asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "To where I belong, and you can come with me." Margaret extended her hand, a gesture both inviting and somehow threatening. "We can cross over together." Elizabeth took another step back. "Margaret, I can't do that. I'm alive. I have a life here." Margaret's expression darkened. So did I, before it was taken from me, before I was trapped between worlds for a century and a half. The temperature in the apartment plummeted, frost forming on the windows. Objects began to rattle on shelves, books, picture frames, small decorative items. "I won't stay here alone anymore," Margaret declared, her form growing more distinct, more solid. "Either you help me cross over, or I'll make sure you're trapped as I was." Elizabeth's mind raced, searching for a way out of this increasingly dangerous situation. She remembered something from her research, the symbol on Catherine's gravestone, the eye in the triangle. A protective symbol. Someone had tried to shield Catherine's remains from Margaret's influence. "There's another way," Elizabeth said quickly. "I can help you find peace without either of us being trapped. I know where your family is buried. We can go there, lay you to rest properly beside them." Margaret hesitated, the rattling objects going still. "My family, they're still here." "Yes, in Salem Cemetery." "I've seen the plot," Elizabeth said, sensing a shift in Margaret's demeanor. "There's a place for you there, a memorial. They never forgot you, Margaret." The spectral girl seemed to waver, her form becoming less distinct. "They looked for me." "Yes. Your father dedicated his life to finding you after you disappeared. That's why his research became so extreme. He was trying to understand what happened to you." This wasn't entirely true. Elizabeth was embellishing based on her limited knowledge, but she sensed that Margaret needed to hear this, needed to believe her family had cared. "Father always said I was special," Margaret murmured, more to herself than to Elizabeth, "that my abilities were a gift." "He was right," Elizabeth said gently. "But gifts aren't meant to keep you trapped. Let me help you find your way to your family, to rest." For a long moment, Margaret was silent, her form flickering like static on an old television screen. When she spoke again, her voice sounded younger, more vulnerable. "I've been alone for so long." "You don't have to be alone anymore," Elizabeth assured her. "But you need to let go of the anger, the need to take someone with you." The lights in the apartment suddenly came back on, making Elizabeth blink against the sudden brightness. When her eyes adjusted, Margaret was still there, though fainter now, like a reflection in glass. "Will you take me to them?" Margaret asked. "Tonight?" Elizabeth nodded, recognizing both the opportunity and the danger. "Yes, we can go now." The drive to Salem Cemetery was surreal. Elizabeth behind the wheel, with the ghostly form of a 19th-century girl sitting in the passenger seat, barely visible in the darkness of the car's interior. They didn't speak during the journey, but Elizabeth could feel Margaret's presence, a cold weight in the air, a pressure against her skin. The cemetery gates were locked when they arrived, a sign indicating it closed at sunset. Elizabeth parked along the street and approached the wrought-iron fence. "We'll have to climb over," she said, eyeing the pointed finials atop the fence. Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I don't need to climb." Her form simply passed through the iron bars, reassembling on the other side. "But you do." Elizabeth hesitated. Breaking into the cemetery at night was illegal, potentially dangerous, and certainly not something she had ever imagined herself doing. But the alternative, refusing Margaret and facing her wrath, seemed far worse. With difficulty, Elizabeth managed to scale the fence, tearing her coat in the process and scraping her hand as she dropped down on the other side. Margaret waited, watching with an expression that was difficult to read. "This way," Elizabeth said, leading them down the winding paths between gravestones. She had brought a flashlight this time, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the names of Salem's dead as they passed. The Holloway plot was, as she remembered it, simple, unadorned, marked by a weathered stone bearing the family name. Elizabeth directed her light toward the small plaque at the base. "In memory of Margaret Holloway, 1859-1871, lost but not forgotten." Margaret drifted forward, her spectral fingers reaching out to trace the engraved letters of her name. "They didn't find my body," she said quietly. "No," Elizabeth confirmed, "but they remembered you. They honored you." Margaret's form seemed to grow more substantial as she stood before her family's grave, as if drawing energy from the connection to her past. "My body is still at the academy," she said, surprising Elizabeth, "in the east wing, behind the old dormitory wall. Father couldn't find it because it was hidden." "Hidden by whom?" Elizabeth asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "By me," Margaret replied simply. "The other me, the part that couldn't find its way back." She turned to face Elizabeth, her eyes now glowing with an inner light. "That's why I'm still here. I'm not complete, not whole." Elizabeth struggled to understand. "You hid your own body. Why?" "I was afraid, confused. When I realized I couldn't return to it, I didn't want anyone else to find it. I used what strength I had to seal it away." Margaret's voice took on a distant quality, as if she were recalling events from another lifetime. "But now I'm ready. I want to be whole again, even in death." Elizabeth felt a growing sense of unease. "What are you asking me to do?" "Find my body. Bring it here to rest with my family." Margaret's form flickered, growing momentarily more transparent. "It's the only way I can truly cross over." "But the academy building has been renovated," Elizabeth protested. "It's apartments now. I can't just start tearing down walls." Margaret's expression hardened. "Then I remain trapped, and so do you." The air around them grew colder, frost forming on the nearest gravestones. The beam of Elizabeth's flashlight wavered, the batteries draining rapidly in the supernatural cold. "Wait," Elizabeth said quickly. "There must be another way. Maybe we don't need your physical remains. Maybe there's a ritual, a ceremony that can help you cross over." Margaret tilted her head, considering. "Father's research. He found ways to separate consciousness from body. Perhaps he also found ways to reunite them." Elizabeth seized on this possibility. "Yes, exactly. Dr. Holloway's papers must be preserved somewhere. The Historical Society might have them, or they could be in university archives." "Find them," Margaret commanded, her form beginning to fade. "I'll be watching, waiting. You have 3 days." With those words, she disappeared entirely, leaving Elizabeth alone among the gravestones. The flashlight flickered once more, then died, plunging Elizabeth into darkness. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at the Historical Society as soon as it opened, tired but determined after a night of restless sleep. Thomas was already there, cataloguing items from another collection. "You look terrible," he observed as she walked in. "What happened?" Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Thomas was a good friend and colleague, but would he believe her if she told him she had spent the previous night in a cemetery with a ghost? "I need to find any research papers by Dr. James Holloway," she said instead, "particularly anything related to consciousness or psychic phenomena." Thomas gave her a concerned look. "This is about the photograph again, isn't it? Liz, I'm worried about you. First the break-in at the society, then at your apartment. Please, Tom, it's important." She met his gaze steadily. "I think I'm close to understanding what happened to Margaret and Catherine." Thomas sighed, relenting. "We don't have much on Holloway specifically, but there's a collection of papers from the Salem Medical Society from that period. He might be mentioned there." They spent the morning searching through dusty boxes of documents, looking for any reference to Dr. Holloway or his work. By noon, they had found several mentions of him attending medical society meetings and presenting papers, but nothing about his controversial research into consciousness. "There's nothing here," Elizabeth said in frustration, pushing aside another folder of irrelevant documents. "We need to look elsewhere." "The university archives might have something," Thomas suggested. "Or the State Medical Library in Boston, but that would take days to arrange access. And even then—" "I don't have days," Elizabeth interrupted. "I need this information now." Thomas looked at her with growing concern. "What's going on, Liz? What aren't you telling me?" Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, then made a decision. "If I tell you, you have to promise not to think I'm crazy." "I've known you for 10 years," Thomas said quietly. "I'd never think that." So Elizabeth told him everything about her research into Margaret and Catherine, her visit with Virginia Whiting, and most importantly, her encounter with Margaret's ghost the previous night. She described the spirit's demand that she find her physical remains or help her cross over through some other means, and the 3-day deadline she had been given. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern to something approaching belief. "You really saw her?" he asked when Elizabeth had finished. "Margaret Holloway?" "Yes, as clearly as I'm seeing you now." Elizabeth met his gaze. "I know how it sounds, but it's true, and I think she's dangerous, Tom. What happened to Catherine wasn't an accident. Margaret may not have meant to harm her, but she did. And I think she could harm me too if I don't help her." Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing what he had heard. Finally, he said, "There's someone you should talk to. An old professor of mine from grad school, Dr. Eleanor Chen. She specializes in paranormal phenomena from a historical perspective. If anyone would know how to help you, it's her." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. "Is she local?" "She teaches at Boston University now, but she keeps an apartment here in Salem. She's fascinated by the city's history." Thomas pulled out his phone. "Let me call her. She owes me a favor." An hour later, Elizabeth was sitting in a small, cluttered apartment near the Salem waterfront, facing an elderly Chinese-American woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Chen had agreed to meet after Thomas's call, though she had made no promises about being able to help. "So," Dr. Chen said, after Elizabeth had recounted her story again, "you've awakened a spirit that has been dormant for a century and a half, and now she wants you to either find her remains or discover a way to help her cross over." "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed, "and I only have 3 days." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The photograph was the tether, the object binding her to this world. By removing it from its hiding place and restoring it, you strengthened the connection, made it possible for her to manifest more fully. "Can you help me?" Elizabeth asked directly. "Perhaps." Dr. Chen rose from her chair and went to a large bookshelf that covered one wall of her living room. She selected several volumes, then returned to her seat. "Doctor, Holloway's research was largely discredited in his time, but he was part of a small group of physicians and scientists who believed that consciousness could exist independently of the physical body." She opened one of the books, revealing a photograph of a group of serious-looking men in formal 19th-century attire. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in London in 1882. But informal groups with similar interests existed earlier, particularly in New England. Dr. Holloway corresponded with several prominent members. "So his research might have been preserved in their archives?" Elizabeth asked hopefully. "Not exactly. After his suicide, much of his work was destroyed or lost. But I've studied this field for decades, and I've come across references to a journal he kept, separate from his published papers, detailing his experiments with his daughter." Elizabeth leaned forward eagerly. "Do you know where this journal might be?" Dr. Chen gave her a long look. "I have a copy of it." "What?" Elizabeth was stunned. "How?" "It surfaced at an estate sale about 20 years ago. I authenticated it and had it digitized before the original was acquired by a private collector." Dr. Chen turned to a small desk in the corner of the room, opening a drawer to remove a flash drive. "The contents are disturbing. Dr. Holloway's experiments with his daughter would be considered abuse by today's standards." She handed the flash drive to Elizabeth. "The journal describes how he trained Margaret to project her consciousness beyond her body, using a combination of hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and certain drugs that were legal at the time. He believed she had a natural talent for it, but he pushed her beyond her limits. Did he ever write about how to reverse the process, how to reunite a projected consciousness with its body?" Elizabeth asked, clutching the flash drive. "Yes, though he never had the opportunity to test his theories. After Margaret disappeared, he became obsessed with finding a way to call her back. Dr. Chen's expression grew somber. His final entries suggest he was planning to attempt the ritual himself, but he took his own life before he could complete it. What kind of ritual? Elizabeth asked warily. A ceremony involving specific objects connected to the person, performed at a location where the veil between worlds is thin, typically a place associated with death or spiritual significance. Dr. Chen hesitated. But Elizabeth, such rituals are dangerous. They operate on principles we don't fully understand. The consequences could be unpredictable. More dangerous than an angry spirit threatening to trap me between worlds, Elizabeth countered. Dr. Chen conceded the point with a slight nod. The journal contains the details of the ritual he planned. But you should know that it requires something personal, something that belonged to Margaret in life. Elizabeth thought of the class photograph. Would that be enough? Possibly. But something more personal would create a stronger connection. Dr. Chen looked at her intently. You're really going to attempt this, aren't you? I don't see that I have much choice. Dr. Chen sighed. Then at least let me help you prepare. The ritual must be performed correctly, or it could make things worse. Elizabeth spent the rest of the day with Dr. Chen, studying Dr. Holloway's journal and preparing for the ritual that might free Margaret's spirit and save Elizabeth from a fate she could barely comprehend. They discussed possible locations, settling on the pond at the former academy grounds as the most appropriate site. As evening approached, Elizabeth prepared to leave, the flash drive and a list of necessary items safely in her bag. One more thing, Dr. Chen said as Elizabeth stood at the door. The journal mentions a key component of the ritual, an object that belonged to both Margaret and the person attempting to call her back. It creates a bridge between you. But I don't have anything that belonged to both of us, Elizabeth said, confused. How could I? Dr. Chen's expression was grave. That's the problem. Without such an object, the ritual may not work, or worse, it might work in ways you don't intend. Be careful, Elizabeth. Spirits like Margaret are often not what they seem. With those ominous words echoing in her mind, Elizabeth left to prepare for what would be either her salvation or her doom. The next evening, as dusk settled over Salem, Elizabeth stood at the edge of the pond where Catherine Prescott had drowned over 150 years ago. The garden was deserted, the apartment residents having retreated indoors against the November chill. She had brought the items specified in Dr. Holloway's journal. Candles, a small silver bowl filled with water from the pond, the class photograph, and a lock of her own hair, a personal sacrifice to strengthen the connection. What she lacked was the object that had belonged to both her and Margaret. The bridge Dr. Chen had warned was crucial. Elizabeth had searched for alternatives, had even considered breaking into the cemetery to retrieve soil from Margaret's memorial plot, but nothing seemed adequate. As darkness fell completely, Elizabeth arranged the candles in a circle and lit them one by one. Their flames steady in the still air. She placed the silver bowl in the center and the photograph beside it. "Margaret," she called softly. "Margaret Holloway, I'm ready to help you cross over." At first there was no response, just the soft lapping of the pond water against the shore and the distant sounds of traffic. Then the air grew cold, the candle flames flickering as if in a sudden draught. Margaret appeared at the edge of the circle, her form more solid than before, almost fully corporeal. She looked at the arranged items with curiosity. "Father's ritual," she said, recognition in her voice. "You found his research." "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed. "Dr. Chen helped me. We can perform the ceremony tonight, help you find peace." Margaret stepped closer, examining the setup more carefully. "It's missing something. The bridge between us." "I know. I couldn't find anything that belonged to both of us. It's impossible. We're separated by a century and a half." A slow smile spread across Margaret's face. "Not impossible. There is one thing." She pointed to the class photograph. "This belongs to both of us now. You restored it, cared for it. Your essence is part of it, just as mine is." Elizabeth considered this. The photograph had been the focus of her work for weeks, and it was undeniably connected to Margaret. Could it serve as the bridge? "Will that be enough?" she asked. "It has to be," Margaret replied. "Are you ready to begin?" Elizabeth nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Following the instructions from Dr. Holloway's journal, she picked up the photograph and held it over the silver bowl. "Spirit of Margaret Holloway, caught between worlds, I call to you. Through this object that connects us, I offer you passage to the realm beyond." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as she spoke the ritual words. "By water, by fire, by earth, by air, I open the way for you to find rest." Adi! The candles flared suddenly, their flames shooting upward before settling again. Margaret's form seemed to solidify further, her features becoming more distinct, more present. "It's working," she whispered, looking down at her hands in wonder. "I can feel it." Elizabeth continued the ritual, drawing the lock of her hair across the photograph and dropping both into the silver bowl. "Let my offering strengthen the bridge between worlds. Let my will guide you to peace." The water in the bowl began to swirl of its own accord, creating a miniature whirlpool. The air around them grew heavy, charged with an energy Elizabeth could feel pressing against her skin. Margaret stepped forward, entering the circle of candles. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible over the strange humming that had begun to fill the air. Margaret's eyes locked with hers, and in them Elizabeth saw something that made her blood run cold. Not peace or gratitude, but triumph. "Now," Margaret said, her voice changing, deepening, "I take what I need." She lunged forward, her hands now solid, physical, grasping Elizabeth's arms. Elizabeth tried to pull away, but Margaret's grip was unnaturally strong. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth gasped. "This isn't how the ritual works." "Father's ritual was meant to call me back to my body," Margaret said, her face inches from Elizabeth's. "But my body is gone, decayed to dust. I need a new vessel." With horror, Elizabeth understood. "You want to take over my body." "I've waited a century and a half to live again," Margaret hissed. "You freed me from the photograph. You created the bridge, and now you'll give me what I need to return completely." Elizabeth struggled against Margaret's grip, but it was like fighting against iron bands. The girl's form was now completely solid, as real and physical as Elizabeth herself. The ritual had worked, but not in the way she had intended. "This won't work," Elizabeth said desperately. "Your consciousness can't just take over mine. Dr. Holloway's journal—" "My father never understood what I could truly do," Margaret interrupted. "He thought he was conducting the experiments, but I was learning too. Learning how to separate my consciousness, how to attach it to objects, to places, to people." Margaret's hands moved to Elizabeth's face, her cold fingers pressing against her temples. "I tried with Catherine, but she was too afraid. She fought me, fell into the pond. But you, Elizabeth, you're stronger. You've been looking for me. You've been inviting me in from the beginning." Elizabeth felt a pressure building in her head, a foreign presence pushing against her thoughts. She tried to focus, to resist, but Margaret's will was overwhelming. "Stop," she managed to say. "This isn't right. This isn't peace." "Peace?" Margaret laughed, a hollow sound. "I don't want peace. I want life. Your life." The pressure increased, and Elizabeth felt herself being pushed back in her own mind, Margaret's consciousness expanding to fill the space. Memories not her own began to flash before her eyes. A strict classroom, a father's clinical gaze, Catherine's frightened face as she backed away toward the dark water of the pond. With the last of her strength, Elizabeth focused on the photograph in the silver bowl. It had created the bridge between them, given Margaret this power. Perhaps it could also break the connection. Fighting against the invasion of her mind, Elizabeth lurched forward, knocking over the silver bowl. The water spilled across the ground, soaking the photograph. Elizabeth grabbed one of the candles, and before Margaret could stop her, touched the flame to the wet paper. The photograph didn't burn immediately, but began to smolder, dark smoke rising from its surface. Margaret screamed, a sound of rage and despair that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "No!" she cried, releasing Elizabeth to lunge for the photograph. "What have you done?" "I see." As Margaret's hands touched the smouldering paper, a strange transformation began. Her solid form started to waver, becoming transparent once more. The pressure in Elizabeth's mind receded, Margaret's consciousness withdrawing. "It was never meant to be this way," Elizabeth said, backing away from the disintegrating spirit. "You were supposed to find peace, not steal my life." Margaret's form continued to fade, her features becoming indistinct. "I just wanted to live," she whispered, her voice now distant, echoing. "To have what was taken from me. At the cost of my life," Elizabeth countered. "That's not right, Margaret. That's not justice." The photograph had now burned completely, leaving only ashes that scattered in a sudden breeze. Margaret's form was barely visible, a faint outline against the darkness. "It's time to let go," Elizabeth said more gently. "Time to find your real peace. Not through me, not through Catherine, but by accepting what happened to you." Margaret's form wavered one last time, then seemed to collapse in on itself, dissolving into the night air. The candles flickered and went out, leaving Elizabeth alone by the pond. For a long moment she stood there, shaking with exhaustion and relief. Had Margaret truly crossed over? Or had she simply lost her anchor to this world, forced to retreat to whatever liminal space she had occupied for the past century and a half? Elizabeth couldn't be certain. But as she gathered the remnants of the ritual and prepared to leave, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was gone. 3 months later, Elizabeth stood in the Salem Historical Society's main gallery, watching as visitors examined the new exhibit, Salem Academy, Education and Mystery in the Victorian Era. The display included photographs, documents and artifacts from the school's long history, carefully arranged to tell the story of the institution and its students. One item was noticeably absent, the class portrait from 1871. In its place was a detailed sketch Elizabeth had commissioned, showing the students and their teacher, but omitting Margaret's second appearance in the shadows. "Quite a turnout," Thomas said, joining her by the entrance. "People love a good mystery." "As long as it stays a mystery," Elizabeth replied quietly. After that night by the pond, Elizabeth had told Thomas and Dr. Chen everything that had happened. Together, they had decided that the original photograph, or what remained of its ashes, should be sealed in a lead box and buried in the Salem cemetery beside Margaret's memorial plaque. Dr. Chen had performed a blessing over the site, a final precaution against any lingering presence. Elizabeth had also arranged for ground-penetrating radar to examine the east wing of the former Academy building where Margaret had claimed her body was hidden. The results had been inconclusive. The extensive renovations over the years had altered the original structure too much to identify any potential hidden spaces in the walls. Elizabeth had decided not to pursue it further. Some secrets perhaps were meant to remain buried. "Do you think she's really gone?" Thomas asked, voicing the question that still occasionally kept Elizabeth awake at night. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I haven't felt her presence since that night. No cold spots in my apartment, no figures watching me from shadows." "And the other students from the photograph? Have you tracked down what happened to them?" Elizabeth nodded. "Most lived ordinary lives. Rebecca Barrett Whiting passed on her story, but the others either didn't know or chose not to remember. People are good at forgetting the things that frighten them." As they stood talking, a young woman approached the exhibit, stopping to examine the sketch of the class. There was something familiar about her profile, the way she held herself. When she turned, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of her face, pale, with dark eyes that seemed older than her years. For a heart-stopping moment, Elizabeth thought it was Margaret, somehow returned in a new form. But then the woman smiled at something her companion said. the expression transforming her features into something wholly ordinary, wholly human. Elizabeth released the breath she had been holding. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, noticing her tension. "Yes," Elizabeth said, turning away from the exhibit, "just seeing ghosts where there aren't any." As they walked toward the Society's offices, Elizabeth glanced back once more at the young woman, now moving on to the next display. For an instant, just the briefest moment, she thought she saw the woman's shadow separate from her body, stretching out in the wrong direction before snapping back into place. Elizabeth blinked, and the shadow was normal again. "Just a trick of the light," she told herself firmly. Just her imagination, influenced by months of researching a girl who could be in two places at once. But that night, as she prepared for bed, Elizabeth found herself checking the locks on her doors and windows with particular care. And as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that somewhere, in the space between waking and dreaming, someone was watching her from the shadows.